My guest this week is an unusual founder in at least two ways. He's been operating his blockchain project since 2017, and he's doing it for people who are most in need of help. It's called Building Blocks, and it claims to be the world's largest humanitarian use of blockchain. It's part of the World Food Programme, where Houman Haddad is head of emerging technologies.
You're listening to CoinGeek Conversations with Charles Miller.
So Houman, you worked for the World Food Programme, and you are responsible for a particular initiative in that called Building Blocks. Perhaps you could just give me a quick introduction to what Building Blocks is all about.
It's at its core a humanitarian blockchain network, which aims to, in a neutral manner, bring various actors together as 100% co-owners, co-operators, and co-governors. So then we can build various humanitarian applications on top of this network, such as value transfers, such as digital identity perhaps. And by putting the people we serve at the very center, gaining a common visibility on who's assisting whom with what, being able to coordinate that assistance to ensure more equitable outcomes, and also making the redemption process simpler for the people who are dependent on that assistance.
And so it's a private blockchain.
It is.
That's been created specially for this project. Yes. And it's been going since 2017.
That's right.
Very early on, really,
Yes.
in the history of blockchain.
Yeah.
How did you get involved with that then? How did you manage to come up with it at that very early stage?
My background is finance. I used to work in the banking sector before I joined the UN. And when I did join the UN, it was also in finance. And in the humanitarian world, a concept of so-called cash-based transfers was taking off. Prior to that, we brought bags of rice and corn and gave it to the people who needed it. And the philosophy of cash-based transfers is to see whether people can make their own choices. So perhaps you might give a food voucher where they might go to a supermarket and choose what they actually may want. And it has several benefits to it, several disadvantages. But as I was within the finance section, the problems with doing that, especially in interorganizational context, were becoming apparent. And I've always been keen on technology. I had read about blockchain a bit. And I thought, could we use blockchain to overcome some of these challenges? I made a proposal about building blocks to our innovation accelerator. It got accepted, and we did a pilot, and then kind of evolved from there.
Right, because one of the advantages is that if there are competition between different agencies, then that can be negotiated through building blocks, and you won't get duplication and things.
Yes, I mean, the way I see it is trying to promote co-opetition, cooperating on the infrastructure, competing on the services. One way I think about it is imagine DHL, UPS, and FedEx. They're all in the business one way or another of delivering packages. Imagine you're in a city that has no roads. Would it make sense for each one of these companies to build a separate road to each house, or to collaborate to put a road infrastructure and then for them to compete on who can deliver the package faster, cheaper, more securely, whatever it might be? And so the idea is kind of more or less the same here. Let's collaborate on the infrastructure and let's see who can serve people better. And of course, we have different mandates. Ours is to end hunger. UNHCR's is to protect refugees. UNICEF's is to look after children. But there are sometimes overlaps. You could be a refugee child that's hungry. So,
Right, yeah. Well, let's just go into the technological side of it a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
If I'm somebody who's a participant in the program, one of the recipients of food or healthcare or whatever, what would the experience be like for me, particularly if I haven't got a phone or something?
That's critical because most of the people we serve don't have phones or connectivity or the digital literacy to manage a private key, which would be the quote-unquote proper blockchain use case. The way we've designed our system is so that the people we serve don't need any of those things or don't necessarily need any of those things. But we do need connectivity and a device at the point of distribution. So for example, in the supermarket, And the people have accounts on the blockchain. The various tokens have gone in there. They've gone coordinated already, and they show up, and they select what they want, and it's checked whether what they're redeeming is available according to their entitlements. And we need to have some form of authentication. In Jordan, it's iris biometrics. In Bangladesh, it was finger biometrics before COVID. But it can be nothing. It can be a QR code. It could be a simple PIN. We don't dictate as building blocks what the authentication mechanism should be. It really depends on the context of the operation, the risks involved. So long story short, we don't want to leave the most vulnerable behind by requiring certain things like phone connectivity, which many may not have. However, our vision is hopefully ultimately the people take ownership and control over their own accounts, which means controlling the private key. And the way we've designed our system, at that stage, we won't simply hand them their private key. They would generate their own private key, and we would transfer ownership to them so that we don't even have their private key.
But let's just go back a step.
Yeah.
To sign somebody up
Yeah.
into the system,
Yeah.
if I just turn up out of the blue and I just give my name, what is it that you will require? I mean, you've talked about different ways of authenticating, but the process would start off by scanning my retina or something, and then what would I come away? In that case, all I need to bring is my eye, I guess. But tell me a bit about how that process works.
There are many, many steps involved. And for the record, we don't store any names, birth dates, or biometrics. We work in a collaborative manner with other organizations who help the same people. So let's take a case of a refugee. You're a Rohingya refugee. You've just crossed over the border to Bangladesh. Either you didn't have any documents or they were burned away. So UNHCR, who is responsible for refugees, would take you in. They would record all of your data to the extent you could provide them, name.
By me just giving answers.
Yeah. So if there is a document, they would use it. If not, whatever you could provide, biographic data, demographic data. And then they would capture your biometrics, including, for example, for your eyes. Now, UNHCR has a mandate for protection. So to the extent possible, particularly for a vulnerable group as refugees, to try to shield their real world identity. So they cannot be persecuted. So what they would do is they would issue you a pseudonymous alphanumeric code as a person. Then typically they would group people into families, and they would issue a code for the family. In Bangladesh, when we assist the Rohingya, is at the family level. So UNHCR would share us with the pseudonymous code, not even for the individual, but for the family, and how many people are in that family.
And would I walk away with this code on a piece of paper? Or
you would have a document, yes. You would have an ID card, because that would be a document that you would need to prove who you are, which would have that code on it, issued by UNHCR. But we don't need the name, birth date. All we need is this pseudonymous
But
code.
UNHCR has the details of the name and everything.
Yes, and they must, as part of their mandate.
And what happens if the person loses the card?
They go back to UNHCR and they get a new one.
Because then they just have to say, they give their name and everything. And
if they're biometrically registered, that can be verified, right?
Yeah.
So now that information would then come to WFP, or actually any other organization that works with refugees would be using the UNHCR data, typically. So then you get this alphanumeric pseudonymous code, and that there's 5 people in it. We as WFP would create a blockchain account for that pseudonymous code, and even that code we don't store on the chain. So there will be a blockchain wallet address. In our own backend, there will be association between the two. We will put food tokens in this account. So when the beneficiary goes to the supermarket or wherever, they select their card. As part of the checkout process, let's say in Jordan, when they would scan their iris, this scan would get converted to a template, end-to-end encrypted, would go to UNHCR, and UNHCR will return simply the family code.
And what is the person in the shop who works in the shop? What device or app are they using to communicate back?
Depends on the context. So in Jordan, for example, because of the iris biometrics, there's a terminal there. So that in Bangladesh, we have our own mobile application. But the point being that what we get back is simply the family pseudonymous identifier biometrically verified, which is enough for us to trigger the private key and redeem the
So the shop will get confirmation, yes, this person has a credit for the food or whatever it is.
Yeah, I mean, they get a confirmation from our blockchain after the transaction that the transaction has been approved, and therefore we as WFP back financially the payment to you for that transaction.
Right. This is a sort of very basic question. Could this be done without a blockchain? Could this just be some great big database?
Absolutely.
And so why didn't you do that? Wouldn't it have been cheaper?
The issue is, again, to think of the humanitarian ecosystem as something that wasn't designed, that evolves in response to various crises, wars, earthquakes, famine. There are multiple organizations assisting the same people. And typically each organization, especially in a non-refugee context, does its own registration. It reaches out or people come to it. So there are many databases that exist and there are many transactions that happen. So the question would become, which one of these databases, which one of these many systems would you use? And sort of a political challenge will be there, that why should it be your system versus ours? So there will be a competition on whose system is best. And through that, the coordination could not happen. And through that, the people we serve could fall on the crowd. So
it's the nature of a blockchain that it feels like it's not owned by the World Food Programme, or...
It's more than just feels. We've went through an extreme amount of thought and effort over the past 7 years to make sure, on paper, on chain, according to our legal documents, everyone is 100% co-owner, co-operator, and co-governor of the network. There is zero hierarchy. And distributed ledger technology in general allows this. But blockchain is a subset of DLT in that transactions can only be added, never deleted, which is an important aspect for us for the transparency and accountability. So really, it's blockchain that guarantees that even at the system level, everything is truly equal. And we hope that is what's going to help us break through the potential barriers of our system versus yours.
But the servers are World Food Programme servers, aren't they? They sit under your jurisdiction?
Our blockchain node of building blocks sits in our jurisdiction. UN Women's blockchain node sits in their jurisdiction. So everyone contains full independent control over their nodes. And it's the nodes that automatically connect together and maintain themselves, forming the blockchain foundation, on top of which we launch our smart contracts or applications such as value transfer, which is what we're using.
So if you want to be an organization that participates in the network, does that mean you need to get your own node?
You must get your own node, yes.
Right.
We have a governance framework which delineates things such as membership criteria to us as UN organizations and international NGOs, with the do no harm principle at heart. We store no sensitive data on chain, although it's private and we protect it heavily. Our assumption one day it could get hacked. And if it gets hacked, there's nothing interesting for a hacker to see there but still, we want to make sure, at least in principle, organizations who have access to the network don't have an intention of harming the people we serve. Then there's such things as network maintenance, dispute resolution, data protection, privacy. And one of the requirements is to operate the same number of validator nodes as other organizations. So this way, as I mentioned earlier, your on-chain power and your off-chain power is equal. And that's how we maintain that neutrality and equality I was referring to earlier.
Now, you're here at the London Blockchain Conference, which is all about Bitcoin SV, which is a public blockchain. What are your thoughts about public versus private blockchain, and particular potential for the work that you're doing?
So conceptually, I favor a public chain because it doesn't make the people we serve and the organizations who use our technology dependent on WFP or the UN or the humanitarian. It will be self-sustaining. In fact, our proof of concept in Pakistan was done on a public chain. We had 100 people for 3 days. We quickly discovered, though, and I'll get to the BSV part of it, we quickly discovered issues with speed and with cost.
Was that Ethereum?
It was Ethereum, yeah. And also the fact that the transactions, although pseudonymous, are still publicly visible. which is why we went to a private implementation, which allows us our gas price is set to 0, so we don't have a transaction cost. We can go much faster than the public chain, and more importantly, it's private. So in that sense, if a public blockchain were to able to solve the speed cost at the same level of security and allow the same level of privacy as we have, I think it would be a better solution, because then we don't have to operate our own infrastructure, at least not blockchain nodes, and we make it less dependable on few actors and dependent on a very large number of actors who have crypto economic incentives to keep operating the network.
It would be cheaper for new people to join, wouldn't it?
Depends on what because operating the nodes are not very expensive, and I know the transaction costs, especially for BSV, are quite low. But if you have millions and millions of transactions, for example, it could turn out that it's actually more expensive than operating
versus no transaction costs at all.
But still, just the fact that you have to operate this node, apply updates to it, worry about whether it's gone offline or not. I think if a cost-effective, secure, and private enough public chain existed, I would vote to switch to that.
Right. So have you reached that point? I mean, you found out about Bitcoin SV here.
The issue is, for the moment, then the transaction would still be public. So it doesn't solve the privacy issue.
In public, but not identifiable.
They're potentially re-identifiable. So if you're serving a small enough community and the public address of the vendor where the tokens are being spent is found out, and through the timing, through, depending on how granular your token is, you could narrow down individuals potentially to fewer, so out of a few hundred to maybe a few tens.
Right.
And depending how intent you are on doing harm, then you could, take additional steps to really go down to the level of an individual. Point is that we're really not comfortable with taking any extra risk, or in that sense, at least doing our best to protect the best we can. And the fact that our chain is only visible to, as I mentioned, people who have a demonstrated history of do no harm, makes us sleep a little bit easier at night, versus if we knew that it's fully out in the public. And yeah, we started in 2017. It's been quite a while, but within the humanitarian community, there is still blockchain is not very well understood. For example, what's touted about blockchain often is its transparency. So there's been articles on the internet about us putting refugee passports on the chain, which is of course ridiculous, and we've never done that. But in that sense, also to gain buy-in and participation. And I feel maybe once we've reached a certain critical mass, once we have more data, and once we have better metrics to evaluate the level of risk versus the benefit we could get about going on a public chain, then that might be a good time to kind of reconsider potentially shifting.
I'm not really able to comment on that question of privacy, but I understand what you're saying, that if somebody were to be able to look at the blockchain with somebody's private key, then they would be able to at least see what transactions were related to that private key. But even if they didn't understand what the transactions really represented, because they're not going to say, 1 bag of flour or something, are they?
But that's a good point. So as I mentioned, one key thing for us is coordination, and the coordination needs to be based on something. So with our tokens, we stop at what we call the category level. So we have a token that says food, but we don't say what food was bought with this token. Because if another humanitarian organization is giving food, if they see WFB is giving food, that's enough either for them to coordinate directly on chain or get in touch with us so we can coordinate off chain, right? But as you mentioned, if it gets down to granular, that we do have that data off chain, rice, corn, chili pepper, salt, everything that is, but that would definitely increase the risk of re-identification.
But I think that on the BSV blockchain, it would all be hashed, so that you wouldn't be able to actually, you're not going to see the word food or anything on chain in public. It's all just going to be a hash.
I think it depends on the properties of the token, but our point is we want to enable coordination. So if we just hash it, then there's no point putting it there to begin with, because we want others to see that this was a food token to coordinate with us.
But I think that the people you wanted to see that could be given access to that so that they could sort of unscramble it.
Well, you could potentially, yes. I mean, you could salt data before hashing it, but if you share the salt, then if that salt gets out, all of your data becomes. So it's not a good security practice to do it. So if you think about it enough, really, you would have to think, what is the main incentive of going public? For me, it's self-sustainability. But if you consider, for us, cost is not an issue. For us, throughput is not an issue. So then when you add this privacy aspect and all its implication, at the moment, it would still be undecided whether, public is better than private or not.
So what is the future for your project? I mean, it sounds like it's stabilized. You've got a large amount of money passing through it now. What are the next steps, or is it just going to continue to do the work that it's doing?
Well, it's we've made a lot of progress in certain parts and not in other parts. The technology, as difficult as it's been, has been the easier part. The change management aspect and the buy-in has been the more difficult part. So we've had now 50 organizations use our system. 40 just in Ukraine. We've prevented $100 million of unintentional overlap, duplication, through this effort. But we haven't had many join formally, as we call it, to set up those nodes, to create that decentralization, to bring that additional level of accountability. And we're a small team of 3.
Really?
Globally.
Wow.
Yeah. So just between managing everything and pushing all of this, we're also trying to do advocacy and all of that. So the next step is really getting that wider involvement. So we have more organizations operating independently their own nodes. And then to foster a better understanding of how blockchain works, how tokenization works, the good practices, the bad practices. And through getting that comfort, maybe then taking the next steps to, for example, digital identity. A refugee on average remains a refugee for 15 years. They are born there, they get married there, they get education certificate, health certificate. If they go back home or to a third country, often that information stays back in the many systems of the many organizations that assisted them. What if they could own that information? What if they could take it? What if they could use it? But even with a simple use case of coordinating assistance, it's still not well understood. So my hope is that we get more people, we make this use case very well understood, and everyone becomes more comfortable with other use cases that could be done on chain, which are technologically ready, but I think as a humanitarian community, culturally, we're not ready for it.
Well, it sounds like an incredible achievement that you've got already. So I just wish you every luck with it, because it's such a fantastic project. And thank you so much for talking to me about it.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Thanks very much to Houman Haddad. Next week, I'll be talking dating apps and BSV startup investment with Kirsty Barony Gibson of Access New York. So please join us for that. And until then, thanks for listening and goodbye.
Hey everybody, I'm Kurt Wooker Jr. Join us live on Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, where you can ask me questions, comments, blessings, cursings, grapes, or gropes. You can catch us live across CoinGeek's YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, and probably a whole bunch of other places too.
I think the big thing here, the big innovation, is the ordinals numbering system.
So utility is driven by this whole idea of springboarding us in terms of innovation by using micropayments and unlocking all these different new ways of doing things.
Decentralization, the meme, as people think of it, I don't think exists at all, anywhere.
Bitcoin mining, Bitcoin wallet, blockchain, stablecoins, MetaNet, the evolution of money. Everybody is talking about Bitcoin today. But what exactly is it? Learn the basics from experts. Learn what Bitcoin is, how it works, and why it matters. Bitcoin 101, your ultimate guide to the fundamentals of blockchain.